The world ended quietly, not with fire nor thunder, but with the long, aching breath that follows a scream too loud to survive. The sea outside her window had stopped moving, as if holding its own grief. Clouds hung low and heavy, mirrors of a heart that refused to rise again. Ilara stood alone in that stillness, her hands trembling, as if they remembered the touch of every soul she'd lost. There was no sound, no pulse of life, only the hush that comes when the universe itself forgets to speak. What if stillness wasn't emptiness, but a voice we never learned to hear? She closed her eyes, and for the first time since the storm, the silence seemed to breathe back. The morning after the storm carried no sound of birds, no whisper of tide. Ilara walked through the ruins of her home as if afraid to disturb something sacred. Each object she touched seemed to remember. The chair her father once sat in, the cracked mug her sister adored, the faded notes of a lullaby still trembling in the air. Time had stopped, but memory had not. The silence felt alive now, pulsing like a second heartbeat beneath her own. She wondered if grief could ever be gentle, if loss could ever speak without breaking what remains of the living. Outside, the air carried the scent of rain and salt, the perfume of endings. Ilara stood at the edge of her yard, where the sea had reached and retreated, leaving behind shells and torn petals from the garden. The world looked like a photograph left too long in the sun. Yet, in the stillness, she began to sense something watching, not with eyes, but with presence. It was not menacing, only patient, as though waiting for her to listen. Her breath caught, and for a fleeting second, the air around her seemed to hum, the way a held note trembles before dissolving into silence. By noon, the silence had grown heavier, wrapping itself around the house like a living shroud. Ilara sat near the window, tracing the grooves in the wood with her fingertips. She could almost feel warmth beneath it, as if the memories inside the walls still breathed. Then, faintly, she heard it. The softest murmur, like someone exhaling her name into the stillness. She froze, her pulse faltered, her breath stilled. It was impossible, yet the air trembled again, unmistakably alive. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of everything she thought she'd lost. As dusk bled into the horizon, Ilara lit a candle and placed it on the windowsill. The flame flickered once, then steadied, its reflection trembling in the glass. She whispered softly, not words, but a kind of offering, a surrender to the quiet that had followed her for days. Outside, the mist shifted, revealing the faint outline of the sea, gleaming silver beneath the moon's rise. In that single stillness, she felt a presence lean closer, neither wind nor dream, but something profoundly tender. For the first time, Ilara smiled through her tears. The silence was no longer empty. It was listening back. The following morning, Ilara woke to a sound she could not name. It wasn't music, nor wind, nor the sea. It was something between them, a hum stitched into the quiet. When she moved, the air seemed to respond, rippling faintly like silk stirred by unseen hands. She followed the sound through the house, her bare feet whispering across the wooden floor. Every object she passed seemed to remember her touch. A spoon trembled, a curtain swayed. The stillness was no longer still, it was breathing. And somewhere within that breath, a voice, faint, familiar, called her name as if from the other side of memory. The sound drew her to the living room, where a box of water-damaged photos lay scattered across the floor. She knelt, lifting one with shaking fingers. The image was blurred, the faces half erased by the sea, yet the warmth within it was unmistakable. She could feel their laughter echoing faintly, like sunlight pressed into paper. Then, as her tears fell onto the photograph, she heard it again, clearer this time. A whisper of her sister's voice humming the lullaby they once shared. It drifted through the silence like a memory made flesh, breaking her heart open with tenderness. Outside, the wind began to rise. Not harshly, but with a careful rhythm, as though mimicking breath. Alara stepped into the open air, her heart racing. The world looked the same, yet something invisible moved through it. She felt her mother's warmth in the breeze brushing her cheek, her father's steadiness in the hush between gusts. Each movement of air carried an echo of love once spoken. She realized, trembling, that the stillness wasn't silence at all. It was a language, and she was finally learning to listen. Later that evening, she found herself drawn to the attic, a place untouched since before the storm. Dust hung thick in the air, but within it lay fragments of the past. A music box, her mother's shawl, a child's shoe. As her hand brushed the box, it opened on its own, the tiny dancer turning though the gears were broken. The melody that spilled out was soft, incomplete, and impossibly familiar. Alara sank to her knees, her heart breaking and healing all at once. The music was wrong in all the right ways. A message carried through the imperfect silence of love. Remember. That night, Alara couldn't sleep. The house breathed around her, its silence now alive with 1,000 unspoken memories. She lay awake, listening, not to find them, but to feel them. The storm had taken their bodies, but not their essence. In every creak, every flutter of curtain, every quiet moment between heartbeats, they spoke. When her eyes finally closed, she felt their presence settle beside her, not ghostly but gentle, as though love itself had found a way to stay. For the first time since loss, the silence didn't ache. It held her. Morning light seeped through the curtains like a whisper of forgiveness. Alara woke to a strange awareness, as though the silence itself had something to say. The air around her carried a low vibration, subtle yet deliberate, humming softly against her chest. She sat upright, listening. The sound was everywhere and nowhere, in the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the wind, the quiet pulse of her breath. Then, faintly, words began to form inside that resonance. You were never alone. The stillness spoke not to her ears, but to her soul. She moved through the house slowly, afraid that a single word might shatter the fragile connection. Every step she took, the silence deepened, growing warmer, denser, almost tender. She paused beside the window where she'd lit the first candle, and in the reflection of the glass she saw something impossible. Her mother's silhouette standing behind her, faint as breath, smiling. No fear, no ghostly chill, only peace. When Alara turned, the space was empty again, but the warmth remained, wrapping her like an embrace she could no longer deny. That evening, the silence spoke again, not through sound, but through rhythm. As Alara sat at the old piano, her fingers hovering over the keys, she felt them move without command. Notes rose into the air, slow and uncertain, forming a melody she hadn't heard since childhood. Her father's favorite song. The sound was imperfect, hesitating, yet filled with soul. She closed her eyes and wept, not from sorrow, but from recognition. The stillness had become an instrument, and her heart, its player. Every note felt like a heartbeat returned from the depths. Later, outside beneath the swelling moon, the air grew still again. Alara walked toward the shore, drawn by something wordless and vast. The tide glowed faintly, a mirror of light and memory. She knelt at the water's edge, her reflection rippling beside hers, then shifting. For a heartbeat, faces appeared within the waves. Her sister, her parents, smiling not in sorrow, but serenity. The sea whispered without sound, and she finally understood. The stillness wasn't around her. It was within her. It had always been their way home. That night, when Alara returned home, the house no longer felt empty. Every creak of the floor, every sigh of the wind carried a memory that no longer hurt. She sat in her chair, the one that used to face her father's, and smiled into the quiet. It was no longer a silence of absence. It was communion. She whispered a thank you into the stillness, and it answered not in words, but in warmth that spread through the room like dawn through glass. Grief had not left her, but it had learned to breathe differently, softer, endless, alive. The days that followed felt lighter, yet more fragile, as though every breath might shatter the delicate balance between worlds. Alara woke with sunlight on her face and the scent of salt still lingering in her hair. For the first time, she opened her windows wide, letting the wind flow freely through her home. The silence no longer frightened her. It spoke in soft gestures, the creak of the beams, the hush of curtains swaying, the pulse of her own steady heart. Yet beneath the calm, she felt something shifting, as if love's voice was asking her not just to listen, but to remember everything she had tried to forget. She began to visit each corner of her house, touching the objects she once avoided. Her mother's shawl folded in the drawer, her father's pipe still resting on the mantel, her sister's journal unopened since the storm. Each item carried the scent and echo of its owner, each one a wound reopened by tenderness. When she finally opened the journal, the handwriting was faint but alive, the ink smudged by years of moisture. Between its pages she found a pressed daisy, fragile yet intact. Her sister's final entry read, "When silence finds you, don't run. It's us." The silence deepened as the sun began to set. Alara sat on the floor, surrounded by memories, her mind echoing with their voices. It wasn't sorrow she felt now, but gravity. The weight of love, too vast to vanish. The stillness grew louder until it was almost sound, vibrating through her chest. She closed her eyes and the world around her shifted. The room dissolved into a shoreline of light. Her family stood there, luminous, not in body, but in essence. They said nothing, yet she understood. Love had not died. It had only changed its language. When the vision faded, Alara found herself alone again. Though solitude no longer frightened her, what unsettled her now was the depth of what she felt. A current of memory moving beneath everything. Even the smallest sound seemed sacred. She walked outside as the first drops of rain began to fall. The world looked reborn. Yet her chest ached with quiet heaviness. To remember them was to love again. And love, she realized, was not weightless. It was the anchor that kept her soul from drifting too far from the living. Night descended softly, wrapping the world in deep indigo silence. Alara returned to her window, candlelight flickering beside her. She could feel the presence of her family still lingering, woven into every shadow, every sigh of wind. She whispered a single promise into the dark, that she would carry their peace forward, not their pain. The flame trembled, then steadied, its glow mirrored in her eyes. Outside, the sea shimmered under the moon, endless and still. And within that stillness she heard them, not calling her back, but guiding her forward. The sea called her back at dawn. Its surface was smoother than glass, reflecting the first light like a second sky. Alara walked the familiar path to the shore, her steps slow, reverent. The air was cool, salted, alive with the breath of something ancient. She could feel the pull of the water in her chest, as if her heartbeat had learned its rhythm. The silence that had once haunted her now guided her every motion. It was no longer a void, it was a mirror. And as she reached the edge of the tide, she understood. To face the stillness was to face herself. Alara stepped into the shallows, the cold water curling around her ankles. It was clearer than she remembered, so clear that she could see the reflection of the sky within it, endless and alive. As the waves moved gently, her reflection wavered, splitting into fragments of light and shadow. For a fleeting moment, other faces appeared beside hers. Her mother, her father, her sister. They didn't speak, didn't move. They only looked back at her, their presence steady, unbroken. Tears fell, blending with the sea. She realized then that she had never lost them. She'd simply stopped being still enough to see. She stayed by the water until the tide began to rise. The the waves whispering softly against her legs. In that rhythm, she heard her name again. Not as a voice, but as a feeling. Love pulsed through the silence like music without sound, filling every hollow place inside her. The stillness became light, the air shimmered faintly, and the sea seemed to breathe. Elara closed her eyes and pressed her palm against the surface of the water. The reflection met her touch and didn't ripple. For one perfect instant, she and her memories were one. Unbroken, infinite, whole. By afternoon, the sea had changed. Clouds gathered, soft and low, and the light turned silver. Elara stood at the water's edge, watching the tide draw lines that vanished as quickly as they formed. Each wave carried away a fragment of her grief. She whispered their names one by one. Not as farewells, but as blessings. The sound dissolved into wind and foam, carried across the horizon. The stillness that followed wasn't silence anymore. It was love returned in its purest form, echoing softly through the world, through her, through everything that still remembered how to feel. When the last light of day sank beneath the horizon, Elara turned from the sea. The stillness followed, gentle and complete. She understood now, the silence had never been a ghost, but a promise, a bridge between what was and what remains. As she walked home through the dimming light, the world seemed to move with her. The air, the earth, the quiet pulse of existence itself. Her heart no longer echoed with absence. It sang softly in rhythm with the stillness. Love had not left her. It had simply become everything. Dawn arrived not as light, but as breath. A slow awakening that stirred the air itself. Elara rose to find her home radiant with softness, as though the walls had absorbed the sea's quiet grace. She moved through each room without fear, her footsteps soundless, her presence steady. The stillness she once feared now lived inside her, not as emptiness but as calm strength. When she opened her window, sunlight spilled over her hands like recognition. For the first time in years, she whispered into the morning, not asking for answers, but offering thanks. And the silence, kind as ever, whispered back. Later that morning, Elara walked through the garden that had once been broken by the storm. New shoots had begun to rise among the ruin. Small, green, defiant. She knelt among them, tracing the leaves with tender care. The air was still yet alive, humming softly like a secret. She realized that silence was not absence but balance. The still point where life begins again. Every petal, every glimmer of dew seemed to breathe in rhythm with her own heart. The garden was no longer memory, it was proof. Grief had nourished the soil, and love had bloomed anew. As evening fell, the sky turned to gold, and the air shimmered with warmth. Elara sat near the sea once more, watching the horizon breathe in light. The silence that enveloped her felt infinite, stretching beyond the world she knew. When she closed her eyes, she felt them again. Her family, not as distant shadows, but as presence. Their love flowed through her like a soft tide, and she realized they had never left. They had become the stillness itself, the quiet between waves, the warmth between heartbeats. She smiled. Stillness was not the end of sound. It was the beginning of peace. When night fell, Elara lit no candle. The moon was enough. Its glow spilled across her home, filling every space where fear had once lived. She walked through the house slowly, her fingers brushing the walls as if greeting old friends. Every creak, every shadow felt sacred now. Reminders of lives that had never truly gone. The silence moved with her, tender and luminous. She realized that peace wasn't the absence of pain. It was the courage to feel it fully and still remain open to light. In that moment, the stillness became her companion, not her memory. Before sleep, she stepped outside once more. The sky was clear, jeweled with stars that seemed impossibly close. The sea lay still, a mirror of the heavens. Alira breathed deeply, feeling the cool night air fill her lungs. Like light itself, she whispered one final prayer, not for the dead, but for the living, that they too might find this stillness and see what she now saw. That love never leaves. It simply changes its shape. The world exhaled with her, and for a brief, perfect instant, she felt both the earth beneath her feet and the infinite above her heart. Dawn unfolded without sound, only light. The horizon stretched open like a promise kept, and Alira felt the world breathe anew. She stood before the sea, calm and eternal, her reflection steady upon its mirrored skin. The stillness around her no longer waited to be understood. It simply was. Every sorrow, every ache that once bound her to grief, had turned into something radiant, woven through her, being like threads of gold. She closed her eyes and whispered, "I'm home." The wind carried the words across the tide, and in their return came laughter. Faint, warm, unmistakably, hers and theirs. She spent the morning gathering shells, each one shaped like a fragment of memory. Some were broken, some whole, all beautiful. As she traced her fingers along their edges, she thought of the lives they once held, of how even the sea remembers its past in pieces. She realized that grief was never meant to be erased, only softened, worn smooth by time and tenderness. Every silence she had once feared now shimmered inside these small treasures, whispering the same truth again and again. Love endures every storm, every ending, every silence that follows. By afternoon, she sat upon the rocks overlooking the water, a quiet smile resting on her lips. She no longer sought their voices. She didn't need to. Their presence was everywhere. In the rhythm of the waves, in the hush between breaths, in the stillness that now lived within her, she finally understood that peace wasn't a place one finds, but something one allows. When she breathed, the world breathed with her. When she was still, everything listened. The stillness had given back not her family's bodies, but their love, infinite, unbreakable, unending. Evening brought a calm that felt almost sacred. The world glowed with the colors of farewell, deep amber, fading lavender, a hint of gold. Alira walked along the water's edge one final time, her footsteps erased as soon as they were made. Yet this time, it didn't feel like loss. It felt like release. The stillness followed her, but it no longer spoke in whispers or memory. It moved through her like breath, like breath. She understood that peace isn't the end of love's story. It is its continuation, written in silence. That night, she returned home and stood in the doorway for a long time, listening. The air was perfectly still. Yet within that stillness, she could hear it all. Laughter, warmth, breath, light. Everything she loved had become part of the quiet she once feared. She closed her eyes, and the silence seemed to reach out, wrapping her in its tender arms. When she opened them again, the stars burned brighter, and her heart, at last, was still, not from absence, but from peace. The stillness had brought them back to her, and in doing so, had brought her back to herself.